when we grow up, we're told this story, this fairy tale about what love is supposed to look like. You meet someone, you fall in love, and everything just works. You build toward that one big day where everything is perfect. The flowers, the music, the guests. It's like the universe has aligned to celebrate your happiness. That's the image we're sold over and over again. Movies, social media, even well-meaning family and friends, they all feed this idea that the wedding itself is the ultimate goal, the finish line of love. And for a while, I believed it. I was caught up in it too. Every conversation revolved around colors, venues, the guest list, what kind of cake we'd have. It felt like I was building a launch toward something monumental. But the funny thing about momentum is, sometimes you don't realize you're accelerating in the wrong direction. I was so focused on the event, on making it perfect, that I stopped asking whether the foundation underneath was actually solid. It's incredibly easy to confuse excitement for certainty. People would ask, "Are you excited for the wedding?" And I'd smile and say, "Of course." Because who wants to admit they're not? Who wants to be the one who questions something that everyone else seems to celebrate without hesitation? The more the countdown continued, the more that question echoed in my mind. Not, am I ready for the wedding, but, am I ready for the marriage? Those are two completely different questions, and I realized I had only been answering one of them. See, there's this unspoken social algorithm that tells us to follow a certain sequence. Meet someone, fall in love, move in, get engaged, have a wedding, and then everything is supposed to make sense. It's like we're conditioned to believe the ceremony itself will somehow fix the uncertainties we haven't addressed. But in reality, no amount of floral arrangements or seating charts can mask emotional disconnection or unresolved doubt. You can't engineer a successful relationship the same way you plan an event. I started to notice little cracks. Not necessarily big, dramatic ones, just moments where I felt like I was compromising my authenticity to keep things running smoothly. I told myself it was normal, that every couple goes through stress before a wedding. And while that's true, there's a difference between healthy stress and silent discomfort. There's a kind of quiet unease that doesn't go away when the music starts playing. It lingers, and deep down, you know why. The fairy tale teaches us that love is about finding the right person. But reality, real, grounded reality, shows that love is also about becoming the right person for yourself and for someone else. And I wasn't sure I was there yet. I wasn't sure we were there yet. It's humbling to admit that, especially when everything around you seems to be screaming, just go through with it. Because once the machine starts moving, the deposits, the plans, the expectations, stopping it feels almost impossible. But here's the truth: sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to go through with something, but to step back and ask why you're doing it in the first place. I realized I had been more committed to the idea of the wedding than to the reality of the partnership. It's not that there wasn't love. There was. But love alone isn't enough when clarity is missing. The fairy tale version of love promises happily ever after. The real version asks you to build happiness every single day, not on a stage, not in front of an audience, but quietly, consistently, when no one's watching. I had to face that disconnect head on. I had to choose between continuing the performance or being honest with myself. And honesty, real honesty, doesn't come with applause. It comes with silence, with discomfort, with uncertainty. But in that space, you find freedom. You find authenticity. So, when people ask why I canceled my wedding, it really comes down to this. I stopped chasing the story that everyone else wrote for me and started writing my own. The fairy tale was beautiful, but it wasn't mine. And in that realization, I learned something powerful. Sometimes walking away from what looks perfect is the only way to move toward what's real. Looking back, it's incredible how clearly you can see the signs once you've stepped away from the noise. At the time, though, I didn't recognize them for what they were. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to. That's the tricky thing about red flags. They don't always appear as bright warnings. Sometimes they show up as small moments you brush aside, tiny compromises that seem harmless in the beginning. You tell yourself, It's not a big deal. It'll get better. This is just part of being in a relationship. But small things, when ignored long enough, have a way of becoming the very reason everything collapses. I remember the first time I felt it. That quiet disconnect. We were at dinner, and I was talking about something that excited me, an idea I'd been working on, and I noticed her eyes drift to her phone. She wasn't interested. It wasn't malicious, just indifferent. I laughed it off, made a joke, changed the subject. But that feeling, that moment of being unseen, lingered. Later, there were more moments like that. Times when I'd share something meaningful and get met with silence or polite nods. You can't quantify that kind of thing, but your gut knows. It always knows. Another sign came in how we handled conflict. We didn't fight often, but when we did, the goal wasn't resolution. It was avoidance. Neither of us wanted to confront the hard stuff. We'd smooth things over, promise to do better, and move on without ever really digging into the root of the issue. That might keep the peace in the short term, but it builds emotional distance over time. It's like a small crack in a rocket's hull. Not catastrophic at first, but if you keep flying higher without fixing it, pressure will find it, and the whole thing can blow apart. Then there was the way we communicated about the future. I'd talk about big plans, where I wanted to go, what I wanted to build, the kind of life I imagined, and I'd notice she'd tense up, or change the subject, or talk about stability instead of growth. Again, not wrong, just different. But I ignored those differences because I wanted it to work. I wanted to believe that love could bridge any gap, that enthusiasm could substitute for alignment. It can't. The truth is, I wasn't listening to the quiet part of myself that was already whispering, this isn't right. And I think a lot of people do that. We silence intuition because it's inconvenient, because it threatens to undo everything we've built, the plans, the commitments, the image we've shown the world. There's this internal negotiation between your heart and your ego, and most of the time, ego wins. It says, don't be dramatic, don't ruin a good thing. Everyone has doubts. And so, you keep building on a shaky foundation, hoping the structure will somehow hold. But it never does, not when truth is missing. One of the hardest red flags to acknowledge was realizing I wasn't showing up as myself anymore. I found myself editing my thoughts, toning down my ideas, compromising on things that mattered, not because she asked me to, but because I wanted to avoid friction. I wanted to be easy to love, but love that requires you to shrink isn't love. It's performance. And when you live in performance mode long enough, you start losing sight of who you actually are. Eventually, I understood that those red flags weren't warning me about her. They were warning me, about the version of myself I was becoming in that relationship. I was comfortable, but I wasn't fulfilled. I was admired, but I wasn't understood. And those two things feel similar until you've experienced the difference. It took a long time to admit that ignoring those signs was an act of self-betrayal. But awareness doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a gentle nudge that won't go away. When I finally stopped rationalizing, stopped explaining away the discomfort, I saw the pattern for what it was, not failure, but feedback. Feedback from life, from intuition, from that part of you that refuses to settle for something that only looks right from the outside. And that's the moment things began to shift. I realized that red flags aren't obstacles. They're signals. They're life's way of saying, pay attention. You're out of alignment. The challenge is having the courage to listen before it's too late. Because the truth is, simple, the signs were always there. I just had to stop making excuses long enough to see them. There's always a moment. A single defining point when everything you've been trying to avoid, ignore, or rationalize suddenly becomes undeniable. It doesn't always come with drama or chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly in a room filled with people, when your mind finally stops arguing with your intuition. For me, that moment didn't come during an argument or some grand revelation. It came on an ordinary evening, in the middle of what should have been a happy conversation about final wedding details. We were sitting across from each other, going through the checklist, seating plans, catering, decorations. On the surface, everything looked fine. But as she spoke, I realized I wasn't really listening. My mind had drifted somewhere else, somewhere deeper. I caught myself staring at her, not out of love, but out of confusion. I was looking for something I couldn't name. It was as if I suddenly saw my life 6 months, a year, 10 years down the line, not the version I had imagined, but the one that felt inevitable if I kept going this way. And it terrified me. It wasn't that she was wrong for me or that I didn't care. It was that the connection we once had evolved into something that no longer matched who I was becoming. The silence between us that night felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits quietly, waiting for you to stop pretending not to notice. When I went home that night, I couldn't shake it. I remember lying awake, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible justification. Maybe I'm just nervous. Maybe I'm scared of commitment. Maybe it's the pressure. But none of those excuses landed. Deep down, I knew what it was. It was clarity, uncomfortable, undeniable clarity. I thought about the version of me that everyone saw, confident, successful, composed, and then I thought about how I actually felt inside. Drained. Anxious. Disconnected. I'd built my life around making bold decisions, trusting instinct, and taking calculated risks. But here I was, about to make one of the biggest decisions of my life, based on fear. Fear of disappointing people, fear of embarrassment, fear of admitting I might have been wrong. And that realization hit harder than I expected. Clarity isn't a gentle teacher. It doesn't coddle you, it confronts you. It holds up a mirror and forces you to see not who you were, but who you've become while you weren't paying attention. In that mirror, I saw someone who had stopped being curious about his own life, someone who was following a script instead of writing one. I realized that if I went through with the wedding, I'd be making a commitment not to love, but to comfort, to safety. And I've learned that safety, while it feels good, can be a slow form of self-erasure if it comes at the cost of authenticity. The next morning, I sat down with a notebook and started writing. I wrote everything, every fear, every doubt, every truth I'd been avoiding. It wasn't a list of reasons to leave. It was a list of things I'd been pretending were fine. And when I read it back, there was no more denying it. The truth was right there in my own handwriting. I had outgrown the version of life I was about to lock myself into. The hardest part wasn't admitting that to myself. It was realizing how many people would be hurt by the decision that clarity demanded. Family, friends, her. People who had invested in this future right alongside me. But the cost of silence would have been even greater. I knew that if I didn't act on what I felt, I'd wake up one day in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow inside. So, I made the call. I ended the engagement. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not relief, not joy, just peace. Because once you finally act in alignment with truth, even the pain feels clean. You stop fighting yourself. That moment of clarity didn't just change the trajectory of my relationship, it changed the trajectory of my life. Because clarity, once seen, can't be unseen. It doesn't whisper, it commands. And when it speaks, the only real question is whether you're brave enough to listen. The decision to cancel the wedding was one thing. Living with the aftermath, that was something else entirely. When you finally choose truth over expectation, there's this strange moment of silence right after. You feel free, yes, but that freedom comes with an echo. It's the sound of everything you thought you knew collapsing in real time. I remember sitting there after making the call, my phone on the table, heart pounding, and this wave of stillness hit me. It wasn't relief yet. It was the awareness that nothing would ever be the same again. The first calls came quickly. Family, friends, people who'd been counting down to the big day. Everyone wanted an explanation. Some were kind, understanding. Others were angry, confused, even hurt. And I get it. When you cancel something as symbolic as a wedding, it doesn't just affect you. It ripples outward. You're not just breaking off a relationship. You're dismantling a vision that dozens of people had invested in. The story people told themselves about you suddenly no longer made sense, and people don't like when their narratives are disrupted. At first, I tried to explain. I tried to justify it in ways that would make everyone else feel comfortable. We just weren't ready. Timing wasn't right. It's mutual. But the truth was more complex, and it didn't fit neatly into a soundbite. I realized pretty quickly that most people weren't really asking to understand. They were asking to reassure themselves that something like this wouldn't happen to them. And that's okay. We all crave certainty. But real life doesn't give you that luxury. Then there were the headlines, the whispers, the speculation. People love a story with tension, especially when it's not their own. I learned to let the noise pass through me. I couldn't control what people said. I could only control how I responded. And I made a choice. I would rather be misunderstood for doing what's right than celebrated for living a lie. The hardest part, though, wasn't public perception. It was personal aftermath, the quiet spaces, the moments when the adrenaline wore off and reality set in. The venue was booked, the invitations printed. There were tangible reminders everywhere of a future that no longer existed. And in those moments, you start to doubt yourself. Did I overact? Was I selfish? Did I just throw away something good? Those questions circle you like gravity, pulling at your resolve. But here's what I learned: clarity doesn't erase pain. It just gives it purpose. The discomfort, the loneliness, the awkward conversations, they're all part of recalibration. Growth is rarely graceful. You lose things. You lose people. You lose parts of yourself that once felt essential. But every time something falls away, you gain space. Space for truth, for alignment, for peace. One of the most unexpected lessons from that fallout was how it revealed people's true colors. Some friends distanced themselves, not out of malice, but because my decision made them confront their own doubts, their own unspoken compromises. Others surprised me by showing up with quiet support, no judgment, just presence. It reminded me that authenticity has a filtering effect. When you live honestly, not everyone will stay, but the ones who do are the ones who truly see you. And then there was her. The conversation we had afterward wasn't easy. There was pain, disappointment, confusion. But beneath it all, there was also understanding. We both knew that continuing would have been unfair. Not only to each other, but to the truth of what we both needed. Letting go wasn't a betrayal, it was an act of respect. Over time, the noise faded. The questions stopped. Life moved forward. And what remained wasn't regret. It was gratitude. Gratitude that I'd found the courage to face the temporary storm instead of living a permanent lie. Because every storm ends, but pretending never does. So yes, the fallout was difficult. It tested me in ways I didn't expect. But it also stripped everything down to what was real. And when all the illusions fall away, you realize something profound. Peace doesn't come from avoiding chaos. It comes from standing in the middle of it, fully awake, and knowing you didn't betray yourself. And that's when you understand, sometimes breaking everything apart is the only way to rebuild something true. After the dust settled, after the noise and the questions faded, I found myself in a strange kind of silence, the kind that's both heavy and healing. There's something surreal about waking up one morning and realizing that the life you were preparing for no longer exists. The plans, the momentum, the identity you built around being part of a couple, gone. And in that quiet, the question that lingers isn't what did I lose? It's who am I now? For a long time, I hadn't asked myself that question honestly. I was so busy building, planning, moving forward that I forgot to check in with the person doing all the building. When you're in a relationship, it's easy to merge identities, to become part of a collective we. You make decisions together, you compromise, you align. But when when's I comes back into focus, and it's like meeting a stranger who has your face. I had to reintroduce myself to myself. The first few weeks were uncomfortable. The silence was loud. I go through my day automatically. Work, calls, meetings. But there was this constant hum in the background, a reminder that something fundamental had shifted. I realized I had been using the relationship as a form of noise, a way to avoid sitting still long enough to hear my own thoughts. And once that noise was gone, there was no hiding anymore. So I started doing something I hadn't done in years, thinking deeply about what actually makes me feel alive, not what looks good on paper, not what makes people nod in approval, but what genuinely lights me up. I began reading again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to explore ideas that challenged me. I traveled alone, something I'd never done before. I spent hours walking, without a destination, just listening, not to podcasts or playlists, but to my own inner voice. It's strange how much clarity you can find when you finally give yourself permission to be still. At first, that stillness felt like emptiness. But over time, I realized it was space I had been too afraid to make before. Space for creativity, curiosity, and reflection. That's when I understood something profound. Sometimes we confuse connection with dependency. We think love means losing ourselves in someone else, when in reality, the strongest relationships come from two whole individuals choosing to walk together. Not two incomplete people clinging to each other to feel complete. I started setting new boundaries, not as walls, but as clarity. I learned that saying no isn't rejection, it's direction. It's how you protect your energy, your purpose, your peace. I stopped seeking validation from outside and began measuring success by internal metrics, by how aligned I felt, by how honest I could be with myself. That process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, days when I questioned everything, moments when I missed the familiarity of what once was. But each time I faced that discomfort, I grew a little stronger. Growth doesn't always feel like progress. Sometimes it feels like loss, confusion, and isolation. But underneath it all, something new is taking shape. You're rebuilding, not your image, but your identity. And slowly, I began to feel grounded again. Not because I had everything figured out, but because I stopped pretending that I needed to. I realized that fulfillment doesn't come from certainty, it comes from alignment. When who you are, what you believe, and how you live finally line up, there's a peace that no amount of external approval can replace. People often think rediscovery is about finding something you lost, but it's not. It's about remembering something you've always had. The quiet power of authenticity, the courage to stand alone, the willingness to rebuild from the ground up, even when it means letting go of what's comfortable. Canceling the wedding wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one I hadn't dared to write before, one rooted not in expectation but in truth. And the more I lived in that truth, the more I realized sometimes the most important relationship you'll ever commit to is the one you build with yourself. Because when you finally rediscover who you are, you stop chasing happiness and start creating it. There's a kind of strength that doesn't look like strength at all. It doesn't roar, it doesn't demand attention, and it rarely gets celebrated. It's the strength of saying no. The kind of no that isn't about rebellion or defiance. It's about truth. It's about recognizing when something, even something beautiful, no longer aligns with who you are or where you're going. When I canceled my wedding, that was my no. Not to love, not to commitment, but to continuing a story that wasn't authentic anymore. We grow up in a world that rewards ways. Say yes to opportunity, to growth, to connection, to everything that keeps you moving forward, and there's value in that. Saying yes opens doors. But saying yes without discernment can just as easily trap you in rooms you were never meant to be in. We're taught to believe that progress is about addition. More commitments, more achievements, more everything. But real progress often comes from subtraction, from the courage to step back, to let go, to say, this isn't right for me. At the time, saying no felt like failure. I had to unlearn that. I had to understand that no doesn't mean giving up. It means taking responsibility for your own alignment. It's not weakness. It's a declaration of self-awareness. When you say no from a place of integrity, you're not rejecting something. You're choosing something better, even if that better is still undefined. The hardest part isn't actually saying the word, it's facing the consequences of it. Because every no creates ripples. People question you. They project their fears, their expectations, their disappointment. You start to feel the weight of all those unspoken judgments pressing against your decision. But what I learned is that peace doesn't come from avoiding disappointment. It comes from knowing that the decisions you make are rooted in truth. In the beginning, that truth felt lonely. I questioned myself constantly. I replayed scenarios in my head. What if I just pushed through? What if I'd compromised a little more? But every time I went down that path, it ended in the same realization. If I had gone through with it, I would have been saying yes to something that required me to say no to myself, and that's the worst kind of betrayal. The one where you abandon your own intuition in order to please everyone else. Saying no forced me to redefine success. For a long time, I equated success with building, achieving, accumulating, but I started to realize that the ability to walk away from something that doesn't serve your highest self, that's success too. It's not glamorous. It doesn't come with applause, but it's real. It's sustainable. And it gives you back the one thing that's priceless, your peace of mind. Over time, that no became a compass. It started guiding me toward choices that felt more authentic. I began saying no to things that drained my energy, projects that didn't align, relationships that lacked mutual growth, obligations that felt performative. And what's interesting is that once I started doing that, space opened up for the things that truly mattered. Life doesn't punish you for saying no. It rewards you with clarity. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about strength is that it's always loud, that it's about pushing harder, enduring more, fighting through resistance. But sometimes strength is quiet. It's sitting alone in the aftermath of a difficult choice, feeling the fear and uncertainty, and staying grounded anyway. It's trusting that even though you can't see the outcome, you did the right thing. When you start honoring your boundaries, when you say no with conviction, something powerful happens. You stop living reactively. You stop building your life around other people's expectations. And in that shift, you begin to operate from authenticity instead of obligation. That's when everything starts to align, not perfectly, but purposefully. The power of no isn't just about walking away. It's about walking toward something truer. It's choosing courage over comfort, alignment over approval. And the irony is, when you learn to say no from a place of honesty, your yes becomes infinitely more powerful, because it actually means something. So, if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that sometimes the bravest decision isn't to hold on tighter. It's to let go. Because the right no, at the right time, doesn't end your story. It just gives you the freedom to begin a new one that's finally your own.